Hello and welcome to Festival of Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly, Director of the festival. Today, I'm talking with Serhii Plokhy, a Professor of History at Harvard University and a leading authority on Eastern Europe. His many books include The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, the Baillie Gifford winner, Chernobyl, History of a Tragedy, Forgotten Bastards of the Western Front, and now Nuclear Folly, a new history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we're talking about today. Serhii, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me on this program. I'm really delighted. Thank you.
Now, take us back to 1961, 1962, because Cuba was one of the big issues then, but it wasn't the only one around, was it?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't, and it certainly was not the main issue on the mind of President of the United States, John Kennedy. Kennedy was really concerned about the Berlin and what was happening in Berlin. And 1961, August of 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. So that was really the center of the Cold War, as it was imagined by everyone in the world, including Kennedy, but not, very interestingly, not the way how Khrushchev looked at that. For him, Berlin Wall, the construction of the Berlin Wall was actually, he equated it to the end of the crisis. Because for him and for East German regime, the main crisis was the flood of refugees from Eastern Germany to Germany. So the Berlin Wall ended that. So again, what we have in 61 and 62 is a very different understanding of what is going on, what is at stake. When you look at the story from Moscow and when you look at the story from Washington, and there's big differences in perception and misunderstandings that come out of that. Misperceptions is a very important part of my book.
No, and I want to come back to that, but I just want to talk to you about a couple of other things. So you also had, I mean, Kennedy had only just been elected, hadn't he?
Yes, Kennedy was elected in the fall of 1960, and in January of 1961, he becomes the president of the United States, the first Catholic president of the United States, very young, certainly by the standards of the time, and even more probably by the standards of today. People believe that he is really weak president. He's unexperienced. He doesn't got the guts to stand up to Nikita Khrushchev, who by that time emerged as the really successor of Joseph Stalin after this all sorts of wars within the party presidium. He emerged as the winner. And he was a very, very tough talking leader, a bully when it comes to the international relations and certainly relations between Khrushchev and Kennedy. So he tried to bully him. He believed, Khrushchev believed that Kennedy owed his election to him because he was trying at that point to interfere in the American elections. So the situation is where you have two leaders of the two superpowers, which are in a very, very unequal starting position. Kennedy himself is not certain of his own abilities. And he knows that Eisenhower, his predecessor in the White House, believes that he's a weak president. He also thinks that Khrushchev believes that he's a weak president. And he has to show something that he is not. And then comes Cuba, the Bay of Pigs debacle. And that is probably one of the lowest points in Kennedy's presidency. And immediately after that, he steps into a trap, agrees to Khrushchev's invitation to meet. They meet in June of 1961 in Vienna, and the meeting goes quite terrible for Kennedy, not in terms of what they agreed on or didn't agree on, but the way how the dynamic of that meeting was developing, and Kennedy later told to a friendly reporter that he was beaten up. He was not in a good physical shape, and he was not certainly in a good political shape after that meeting. And then immediately after that comes Berlin Wall. So what you see in 1961, it's also the year when Yuri Gagarin goes into space. So there are all these successes for the Soviet Union, and just one failure after another for this untested, unexperienced young president. That is a background for the Cuban Missile Crisis in many ways.
But just to add a little bit to that, which is about the Bay of Pigs. Now that was an utter disaster, wasn't it? But for Kennedy.
What Kennedy was trying to do, he was trying to project a new image, if not start a new policy in relations with Latin America. And he, on one hand, he bought into the policy of the previous administration by Eisenhower that Castro was a communist. Well, Castro was not a communist before the Bay of Pigs, really. That's what I'm trying to show in my book. But there was a belief that it is a communist revolution. So he thought that he had to do something about that, but he was not prepared to commit troops. He was not prepared to show the hand. So at the end, he allowed the invasion to go on, but refused to give the military support for the invasion. And it ended up with really a black eye for the United States of America on the international arena. Major victory for Castro. But Castro also got really scared. He thought, and Khrushchev thought the same, that, okay, Kennedy will come back. And next time he will come back, he will do that the right way. So there will be military support. And the question that emerged in the mind of Castro and in the mind of Khrushchev at the same time, what can we do about that? What can we do about the coming American invasion? Again, what we know now is that the US military were pushing for the invasion, but Kennedy didn't want it. So it doesn't mean that the invasion was really coming. But that's what Khrushchev and Castro thought at that time. And Khrushchev was trying to help Castro, but not jeopardizing relations with the United States. When Castro was desperate, and he was sending very clear signals to Khrushchev that if the assistance and help, and military help in particular, if that kind of help is not coming, he was going to jump the ship and join Mao Zedong. And Mao at that time was, and Communist China were the main rivals of the Soviet Union in the communist camp. So there was also a competition for the leadership in the communist camp between Moscow and Beijing at that time. And this is part of the story that is not completely unknown. It certainly is not part of the I would say, mainstream narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was a very important part of the actual story of the crisis.
Now, at this time, you had two leaders. Both of the Second World War wasn't that far away, 17 years.
It wasn't.
And that had ended with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the use of nuclear weapons and the devastation that had caused, and there had been various nuclear tests and so on after that. I mean, both leaders seemed, you had to be, as a leader, willing to use nuclear weapons. That was the kind of, the point about mutual assured destruction. But both were also terrified of that. Is that the case?
Absolutely. You had to be maybe not the leader who is prepared to use the nuclear weapons. Or no, I'll put it differently. Not the leader who is willing to use nuclear weapons, but you had to be the leader who was perceived as someone who was prepared to use nuclear weapons. So that was the trick. That was the basis for what the Secretary of Defense, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, later formulated as the mutually assured destruction. But behind that image of a tough leader who was prepared to use nuclear weapons were, of course, the people who lived through the Second World War, through that enormous devastation. They were in different positions. Of course, Kennedy was a lieutenant in the Pacific, and Khrushchev was a political commissar of major groups of armies during the Second World War. But they both went through that carnage, and they also were shaped as politicians by Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Castro Bravo, the first test, which went very wrong, of the hydrogen bomb. And then in 1961, to announce the coming of the communist age, Khrushchev exploded Tsar bomb, the biggest thermonuclear weapon that was ever used in the world till now, till today. So it was tested in 1961. So they were scared of the weapons that they were actually developing. And that was a good thing, in a sense that I was surprised by the amount of the misunderstandings and misjudgment on the both sides. But then the next question that I asked, okay, if there is so much misunderstanding and misjudgment, why we are still here? Why the world didn't end up in the nuclear holocaust in the early 1960s? And the only reasonable answer that I was able to provide was pointing at this deep-seated fear in both leaders of the nuclear war. And it wasn't irrational. It was very rational given their own experience in World War II, but also given what they knew about the destructive power of the nuclear weapons. So that fear was also extremely important part of the story, and that was the part of the story that led eventually to some form of happy ending.
I mean, Kennedy himself had written a book about Britain's preparedness for, well, his senior thesis at Harvard was on that, and it was published as a book later. And clearly he was influenced by the issues that had come up about the British appeasement policy. And then on the American side too, you had them really quite influenced by Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, about how nations kind of stumbled into the First World War.
Yes, there was a lot in Kennedy's upbringing and in his education as a political leader that brings us back to Britain, and not just to the Britain before the start of World War II, but also after, because there were these claims that Kennedy really won the White House in 1960 on Churchill's ticket. And Churchill, given that Britain, of course, has been much closer to the Soviet Union, to the Soviet threat, than were the United States. So Churchill started to think much earlier about this possibility of really the nuclear war that would annihilate certainly Britain and then part of Europe. The US was late in that, certainly was not thinking in those terms before Sputnik. And in that sense, this fear of the nuclear war that can't be really won in Kennedy's thinking very much comes from Churchill and British thinking at that time. On the other hand, there was connection to Europe and European history, and it is certainly the connection that is most obvious through the book by Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. And he read, the book was just published, was very well reviewed, and Kennedy got it. He read the book and was so much impressed by it, but that he ordered copies of the book to be sent to the key military commanders, US military commanders, all over the world. So that's, I don't know what Barbara Tuchman's reaction to that was. I think as an author, she was probably pleased. But that just to illustrate how impressed Kennedy was by the book. And the specific issue that he was impressed by was this argument that Barbara Tuchman puts forward about almost an accidental start of the war. One thing leading to another, that wasn't a big design on anybody's part. As historians, we can argue about that. But that was the take, and it really influenced Kennedy. And he was talking about possibility of misunderstanding, not just to his military commanders. He was talking about that to Khrushchev. I mentioned their meeting in June of 1961 in Vienna. So he was talking about misunderstanding that, okay, that this is one thing that we should avoid. And Khrushchev at some point even exploded about the whole thing. So for him, there was no misunderstanding. There was just class struggle, and there was imperialism and socialism and so on and so forth. What can be misunderstood about that? So that was Khrushchev's reaction. So the point is that, and that's where my surprise as a researcher and then writer came from, was that with Kennedy being so much concerned about the issue misunderstanding, how many misunderstandings actually there were there in the story. The two sides couldn't really agree on almost anything, partially because they looked at that from different perspectives. There were huge blind spots. Just one example, Kennedy tries to figure out why Khrushchev put missiles on Cuba. And he's saying, okay, Russian experts explain to me what is going on. It's almost like we would put our missiles in Turkey. And the assistant to the Secretary of State tells him, Mr. President, but we have our missiles in Turkey. He rejects it. No, it was a different time. It was different administration. It was Eisenhower, so it doesn't count. But the point was that both Eisenhower put missiles in Turkey, and then Khrushchev put missiles in Cuba for the same reason. At that point, they didn't have long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, or didn't have enough of them to threaten the other side. So they were taking their medium-range missiles or intermediate range missiles and putting them closer to the borders of the potential enemy in the future war. So this is just one of example, but again, the book is full of those, and on part of Khrushchev, there are just some basic, not just misunderstanding, but lack of understanding of how democracy works, how much power the president might have. So he grew up as a political leader in a very different environment, and like all of us, we just try to understand the world in our own terms, and this is not always means that these are the terms that other people or the world itself actually works on the basis of.
I want to talk about a couple of other things which came out in the book. I mean, but there's lots of new things in this book. I mean, anybody who's read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, studied it, would see that when you read the book. And certainly you managed to get access to new files, didn't you, that were held in the Ukraine?
Yes. One thing that I did, I relied on some of the materials from the Soviet side that have been available, but are not part of the either American or British or Western narrative of the crisis, because the traditional historiography is very much influenced by Robert Kennedy's memoir, 13 Days. And the narrative is really focused on the White House, what was happening in the White House. But by definition, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an international crisis. It is reflected even in the name. And that's what I was trying to do. Some of the sources from the Soviet side that I used, I probably was, not probably, I know that for sure, I was the first scholar, the first historian to get access to them. And those included the KGB reports on the shipment of the Soviet missiles and military personnel to Cuba. their stationing there, and then their return withdrawal from Cuba as the result of the agreement that was reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And every ship that was there had a KGB officer who were doing a thorough work of reporting on the thoughts and the conversations that the Soviet military had between themselves, what they thought about the whole adventure, about the American surveillance of the ships, and a lot of other details. But there are two big things that this brand new sources allowed me to write about and think about. One of them was the way how the Soviets actually were able to hide the fact that they were bringing those missiles to Cuba, hide the fact that there were 43,000 Soviet officers and rank and file that were shipped to the island. The United States intelligence, that was probably one of the biggest failures in the US Cold War history. They thought that there were between 6,000 and 10,000 troops. They never realized that apart from the strategic missiles, medium range missiles, there were also tactical nuclear weapons. And the KGB reporting allow us to understand how it was done. And it was done basically by putting the Soviet military in almost inhuman conditions in the way how they were shipped across the Atlantic. They were kept in the twin decks, overheated twin decks, were not allowed on the surface so that the American airplanes would not detect them, and so on and so forth. So that is one insight that this brand new sources really helped me to do. Another was the understanding of the sheer humiliation that the Soviet military suffered as the result of the withdrawal from Cuba. Not the withdrawal per se, but the way how it was done. And what happened there was that Khrushchev actually failed to convince Castro to go along with the deal that he signed with Kennedy. Again, a little known story, but very important part of the story. Castro didn't allow any inspections of the sites, and that meant that there was no way for Kennedy to verify whether the missiles were removed or not. So Khrushchev, realizing that, ordered his military to show the missiles, to show the equipment to the American ships and American airplanes already on the high seas. So I called it a strip search almost. And that was extremely humiliating for the Soviet military, to a degree that, again, the KGB reports describe a situation where the captain of the ship got orders to show to the Americans what was what weapons it was carrying. And the commander of the military detachment on that ship would refuse to do that. And eventually KGB had to interfere and to convince the military to go along. So that humiliation really had a very important political continuation or impact, in the sense that when 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Khrushchev's former allies and his proteges really in the leadership decided to remove him for a number of reasons, including the handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What the Minister of Defense, Marshal Malinovsky, the guy who was very close to Khrushchev through the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, what that marshal told his brass was that never in the history of either Russian army or the Soviet army we suffered that level of humiliation as it was during Cuba. So that was an emotional factor that certainly helped him and other military to back the coup against Khrushchev, who officially was the commander-in-chief.
I mean, certainly morale amongst those troops that were shipped over was very low, wasn't it?
It was.
And I mean, some of them even were at the end of their tour of duty only to have to see it extended. And when they got to Cuba, there were all sorts of problems. I mean, you point to them in the book about the fact that the Soviet Union hadn't anticipated a hurricane season, that food went off very quickly, and so on.
Yes, for the Soviet army and for the Soviet Navy, that was really very, very unusual situation and huge challenge in general. So the army, again, going back to Marshal Malinovsky and what he was saying about the Russian army and the Soviet army. Either Russian or Soviet army, despite huge experience in fighting the wars, all of those were the wars of basically almost a landlocked empire. So it was fought in Europe or in Eurasia. And the Navy was used as in support of the ground troops. So either Russia or the Soviet Union or Russia today, they don't have didn't have the kind of Navy that could match or compete in any significant way, either with British or with American. So for them to get all the way to Cuba, and with their ships, with their submarines, nuclear-armed submarines, that was quite a feat. They were not prepared. They didn't know what the conditions are or what to expect in the Caribbean. The whole idea about the fact that about ability to hide the missiles that were 22 meters long under the palm trees was a ridiculous one. Again, that betrays your thinking of someone who lives in Russia and deals with the forests of Siberia. And the equipment was created again to fight in the European conditions. So it would not function in the humidity of the Caribbean. The same was true for the submarines. They were created for the North, for the Barents Sea or for the North Sea. So for the war in the Northern Hemisphere. So there were a lot of surprises for them, including the poisonous shrubs or trees or leaves and things like that. All of that was completely new for them, which of course contributed to the morale really going very low. They didn't have, of course, any form of a way to refrigerate the food. The food was getting spoiled. They didn't have other supplies. And again, we learn about that also from KGB reports. On the other hand, there were, of course, a lot of ideological indoctrination. And there were people who believed certainly in the whole idea of the world revolution and helping out the revolutionary Cuba. For a generation of Khrushchev himself, that was kind of a replay of their youth. And the idea of the world revolution was there. Again, they were trying to be careful not to go all the way, not to be hostages of that idea, but certainly that was a replay of their youth for them. So the issues with morale, the issues with discipline led to the situation in which really Khrushchev lost control at some point over his troops. It's almost like Castro managed to take over. Castro ordered to start firing at the American airplanes, creating a situation which basically for many Soviet commanders, it reminded the conditions already of the war. If the war was not there, they believed it was coming within the next few minutes. And against orders from Moscow, the local commanders make a decision to fire and shoot down the American U-2 airplane. So the diplomatic crisis right there turned into, if not shooting war, but certainly in the crisis that was much more than diplomatic. Again, adding to the tension.
I mean, the idea, which comes across very clearly in your book and in other accounts as well, but very clear in your book, is this idea that we were lucky, we got through this. you know, with everything that went wrong and could have gone wrong. And there's some really quite frightening moments in the book, I thought, where, you know, the troops on the ground almost had a license to fire a nuclear weapon in terms of the Soviet forces, and just the inability of communications between both sides. It took a long time to translate and get those messages through, didn't it? This was before we had email and even fax machines and things like that.
Exactly. It was almost. I didn't believe what I was seeing in my sources. Have to go back and recheck. So before the crisis and during the crisis, it was taken approximately 24 hours for a letter from one leader of the superpower with the nuclear weapons to arrive to another leader. Again, you had to, according to the protocol, you have to deliver this letter, let's say in Moscow to the American embassy. They didn't have the right to just send it right away to Washington. They had to translate it. Then they had to put it into code, right? Which is an excellent way probably for the code breakers, because they know the text. And then it goes to Washington. It's being decoded, and by that time, given the time difference, the president is already sleeping. So 24 hours in those conditions. So Khrushchev, being of course the person who was very again, not well educated, but certainly was very shrewd, smart, and he was a street fighter. So he was looking for the ways of how to deal with that. So then his two last letters to Kennedy were broadcasted by Radio Moscow. So that was the easiest, the fastest way to get the letter to the American president. And yes, he was right in that sense. There is another example in the book that demonstrates the fact that the Cuban Missile Crisis was not fought or didn't happen in our today's world, but it was pre-information age. So there is this very well-known phrase that is used there about the blockade and the Soviet and the American ships meeting each other and then turning back. It's almost like parallel to the tanks at the checkpoint Charlie in Berlin. And the phrase was coined by one of the Kennedy's advisors, and it went as we looked it seems to me, eye to eye, and the other side, the other guy blank. And the point is that when they realized that the Soviet ships turned back, it was 24 hours after that already happened. And the irony of the situation was that the minutes after Kennedy gave the order to attack the ships, the news arrived that they turned back. But Kennedy gave order to attack the ship that we already had in back for probably 20 hours or 24 hours at that time. And that's just one of the many examples of not just misunderstanding, miscommunication, but it's all about lack of reliable intelligence, and really lack of the technology at that time to really follow the actions of the other side in real time.
Now, you've talked about Robert Kennedy's book, 13 Days, and there was the famous film and so on, but it actually wasn't 13 days. 13 days was part of it, but it went on for what, another 23 days after that. We tend to look at the 13 days as against what happened after that.
Yes, absolutely. It was not 13 days. There were, in fact, two crises within one crisis. And the first one was about of course, missiles. The resolution of that crisis on the level between Kennedy and Khrushchev didn't mean that the crisis was resolved, because there was this one more participant in that story, and that was Fidel Castro, who refused to accept the deal for a number of reasons, but one of them was that despite declaring himself a communist, first and foremost, he was a leader of the anti-imperial revolution, which happens to be the revolution against the U.S. Influence and U.S. presence and U.S. control over the island. But he was not eager to really replace one master in Washington for another master in Moscow. So for him, symbolically, that was extremely important, that the issue of Cuba was decided without Cubans, that he was not invited, that he was not informed, that he was not consulted, and so on and so forth. And he also was afraid that withdrawal of the Soviet troops meant that the American troops are coming. So that meant that the crisis actually lasted all the way until November 20th of 1962. And its another component was the Soviet bombers that were on the island. And they were capable of delivering bombs, and the Soviets actually brought the bombs, nuclear bombs, to Cuba. Kennedy interpreted the deal as the one that included not only missiles, but also the bombers. And again, there was a lot of back and forth and a lot of protests coming from Castro, but eventually Khrushchev decided that he will remove the bombers, whatever Castro thought about that. He was almost prepared to lose Cuba to Mao Zedong, but not to risk the war anymore. So technically speaking, Cuban Missile Crisis, yes, maybe it is 13 days, but it was the Cuban nuclear crisis. It's a much longer story, and the story largely unknown.
And so it ended. Who came out best from it out of, do you think, the three main leaders?
Well, this is an excellent question and a tricky one. And I kept thinking about that already after the publication of the book. And at the end, I will say something that is not in the book and is part of my kind of later thinking about that. It's not in contradiction to what is in the book, but it's additional, it's kind of a new spin on that. The real victor was Fidel Castro. And the Castro regime lasted up until this year, right? And maybe in some form continues still today. The role Castro maybe not formally in the position of power, but certainly is the power behind the throne still today. So probably the Castro regime lasts even today. And it wouldn't last without that particular deal on Cuba, where the Khrushchev got in exchange for withdrawing missiles, Kennedy's pledge not to invade Cuba. So the irony is that Castro was the man who was the unhappiest about the way how the crisis was resolved. I would say that technically Khrushchev was probably a winner as well. If you think that before the crisis, there was a threat of the American takeover of Cuba, and there were American missiles in Turkey. With the resolution of the crisis, the threat to Cuba was removed. Khrushchev established himself as the leader in the communist world who can protect his clients or communist allies, and the Americans withdrew the missiles from Cuba. But in the eyes of the world as a whole, Khrushchev was a loser. One reason was that he stuck to his word and kept the Turkish deal secret. That's what Kennedy wanted him to do. And another reason was that his own people around him, who agreed with everything that he was suggesting, because that's how the power was organized in the Soviet Union. There was no speak-up culture in general. So they thought that he was basically a nut. that almost for nothing he brought the world to the brink of the nuclear war. So that was one of the in their eyes indications that he was not really stable, and they had to do something about it. Kennedy emerged in the eyes of the world as the winner, and in the eyes of the electorate or public in the United States, in the eyes of the political class. So there is a profound change as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the dynamic of relations between Kennedy and Khrushchev. So Kennedy that we know today, and the Kennedy that is mythologized and is this strong and decisive president, this is really the product of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That image of today, it doesn't reflect probably good half of the Kennedy's presidency, the presidency before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, it's one of many, if not misunderstandings, then certainly ironies of history. There's this issue of winners and losers in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the ultimate winner, of course, all of us.
Yeah. And I was exactly 2 years old on the day the Cuban Missile Crisis started. So the fact I had more years means that I was, as you say, was one of those winners as well. Let's come to today and what this means for today, because since the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's been various nuclear disarmament treaties, test ban treaties, and so on. But you, at the close of your book, you talk about how we're almost in a similar period now to what was existing before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is but much worse in a way, given the proliferation of nuclear weapons and some of the states that might now or do have access to them.
Yes, absolutely. Normally when you write a book on history, what you hear from your editors is, okay, just tell us what is the lesson and how it is related to today. And I was getting that kind of a notion as well, but I really was surprised to see how many parallels are there, and was surprised myself to see that really the Cuban Missile Crisis can provide an insight that can be useful today. And why I came to that conclusion is that the treaties that you mentioned, and it started with the treaty signed by Kennedy and Khrushchev in 1963 on the partial test ban that stopped the nuclear explosions and tests in the atmosphere. So all these treaties, and then there followed the treaties between Nixon and Brezhnev, and there was, of course, Carter, and eventually Gorbachev signing agreements with both Reagan and Bush. All of that, the beginning of all that story is in the nuclear war scare of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, if you look at what is happening in the terms of the arms control, no agreement, with the exception of the test ban treaty that was signed during the Cold War, is in force anymore. The last one was abandoned in the year 2019. There are some other agreements, but generally we are in the situation that is closest probably to the pre-Cuban Missile Crisis world, with very little regulation of the nuclear arms race, which is already underway for probably more than 10 years. And the nuclear arms race of today is basically different from the nuclear arms race of the 1950s or 1960s, in terms of the number of the countries that are already have nuclear weapons, started the program of rearmament, and especially the number of the countries that actually can acquire nuclear weapons within a very short period of time. We are really fooled by the numbers that there is only, if I'm not mistaken, I have to go, but nine nuclear powers in the world. if things go wrong, they can double and triple within a very short period of time, because the capabilities to build the bomb, and up to 40 countries, again, depending on how long that could take, possess that capabilities or some form of that capability in today's world. So we have a much more drivers on the nuclear highway, and much less lights, traffic lights on that highway than we had before. So that is where the parallels with the pre-Cuban Missile Crisis history come to the fore. And one more thing in terms of things being maybe on some level more dangerous than they used to be. One is, of course, the number of drivers, the lack of treaties, but also the lack of the fear of the nuclear war that was really a very important factor in the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The generation, the public in general, our political leaders from public sense into the offices and who have this right to make those decisions. We're all the product of the world in which those things were regulated. And then the end of the Cold War, we're now more skeptical about the idea that it was the end of history and the victory of liberalism. But we still believe that that was the end of the nuclear arms race and the possibility of nuclear annihilation, which is a false belief. The world changed quite dramatically, but one thing didn't change. We still have only two superpowers in the world today, and it's the United States and Russia. So a lot of things change, but certain things, when it comes to the nuclear arsenal, didn't change. Again, the numbers of the warheads is less, but in terms of the superpowers, there are still two superpowers. It's a very different world. There's a very different weight of Russia in economic terms and revisionist policies on the part of Kremlin compared to the policy of what was there in the 70s or 80s. So again, I unexpectedly probably found many things that Cuban Missile Crisis can, if not explain, but certainly warn us about when it comes to our today's world.
Perhaps President Biden should send copies of your book to military commanders around the world, as President Kennedy sent The Guns of August around the world.
Well, I certainly wouldn't mind.
We should suggest that. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
There's many more events on our website and on our Crowdcast platform, and do join our mailing list to be the first to hear about these. Most of all, do read this wonderful, gripping book about a time when the world was nearly destroyed and which has many lessons for today. As it says in the book, looking back is an essential prerequisite for moving forward. You can get copies of Nuclear Folly from our partners at Waterstones and all good bookshops. Thank you, Serhii Plokhy, for your brilliant work and for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.